What's good everyone, Chessinators finally back with another YouTube video. I stream nearly daily on Twitch at Chessinators, feel free to check it out. Let's get straight into the game. Daniil Dubov is playing with the white pieces against Sergei Karjakin. This is the final game of the Russian Chess Championship. Karjakin is leading the tournament alongside Jan Nepomniachtchi, so there are big stakes on this game. Dubov opens with e4, Karjakin goes e5, Dubov goes knight f3 attacking the pawn on e5, knight c6, bishop c4. This is what we call the Italian game, everyone. Now, Karjakin plays bishop c5. This is one of the most common moves along with knight f6. Bishop c5, Dubov goes c3, knight f6, d4, taking action in the center. Now, pawn takes d4 is played by Sergei Karjakin, and here white has a couple of popular options. I will later reveal what Dubov went for. e5 is a common move, d5, bishop b5, knight e4, pawn takes d4, bishop b6. In this position, black has relatively comfortable development 3 pieces out of the board, and is ready to break in the center with the f6 move. In addition, if bishop takes c6 is played at any point in time, black will recapture towards the center b takes c6, and also be able to break in the center with c5. Another option for white is to take on d4, and after bishop b4, white can consider if they want to play bishop d2, or if they're going to go for the gambit line with knight c3, knight takes e4, and castles. Dubov, however, surprises Sergei Karjakin in a great fashion. He goes b4. This move has only been played dozens of times, which is very little, taking into account that the position on the move before has been reached thousands of times. You know what b4 reminds me of? Let's go back a couple of moves and have a look. b4 in this position, the Evans Gambit, as after bishop takes b4, white goes for a similar idea, c3, followed by d4, trying to grab the center. Let's return to the game. b4. Now Karjakin is faced with a choice. Where should he move his bishop? Should he play bishop b6 or bishop e7? It turns out in some games people have been so fancy as to go bishop f8 and bishop d6 as well. Anyways, Karjakin chose to play, I'll reveal it in a moment. Let's have a look at bishop e7 first. Here, after the move e5, black has a very interesting option. In fact, it's to go d5. Now you might be wondering, after pawn takes f6, isn't white up a piece? And if pawn takes c4, pawn takes e7, and if we count the pieces, white has 3 pieces against black's 2? Well, in turn, it's not so simple, as after bishop takes f6, b5, attacking the knight and provocating it to go to the rim of the board, black instead plays knight e7, and after bishop d3, pawn takes c3. In this position, we see that black has 2 very strong passed pawns, namely the pawn on c3 and the pawn on d5, as compensation for the missing piece. However, Sergei Karjakin opts to play bishop b6. Daniil Dubov plays e5, attacking black's knight, and in this position, black really has 2 options, either to go d5 or knight e4. Let's look at d5 first, a typical counter-strike to e5 in these Italian positions. Pawn takes f6, grabbing the knight. Pawn takes c4, taking the bishop. And now, white needs to play b5. This is a very important move, and I'll show you why in a moment. Now black will go knight a5, and the knight on the rim is dim. It's a little bit misplaced. Now, however, if white goes queen e2, bishop e6, and only then goes b5, I encourage you to take 10 seconds to figure out what black's coolest move is in this position. Alright, in this position, Viswanathan Anand was playing black in fact in 2017, and he went for the gorgeous knight b4. And it turns out, after pawn takes g7, rook g8, pawn takes b4, that black has given away a piece, but has very big compensation with the two passed pawns d4 and c4. Another point is that pawn takes b4 right away, then black simply takes on f6 and reaches a very similar position to the previous one, but with a pawn up. So pawn takes g7, rook g8, pawn takes b4, queen f6, getting the queen out and getting ready to castle. Now I'll go through this game rather quickly, because it's not the main focus of this video. I just want to illustrate a very cute tactic, which is why I'm showing it. Castles, queen takes g7, g3 defending against mate, long castles, a4 trying to go a5 and trap the bishop on b6, d3, queen b2, and I encourage you to stop the video for however long you might need to take to figure out what move Viswanathan Anand played in this position. Alright, he went for the very unexpected move queen takes g3, sacrificing the queen in Botez fashion. Does he have a deep idea behind it? Well, let's figure it out. Pawn takes g3, rook takes g3, king h2, rook takes f3. Now, there are three things I will never truly understand. The beauty of chess, that you can go for such moves, like queen takes g3, and mathematics. In this position, we see that black is threatening rook h3, king g2, followed by rook g8, checkmate. So why try to defend with bishop g5, bishop d4 attacking the queen, queen d2, rook g8, rook a3, h6, rook g1, rook h3, king g2, rook takes g5, king f1, rook takes g1, king takes g1. And here, after the simple move bishop d5, there is no way to stop rook h1 checkmate. It's a very economical mate, in the sense that if you take away one of black's pieces, it wouldn't be mate anymore. Notice how the pawn on f2 cannot move, as it is pinned to the king by the d4 bishop. Now let's return to the game by Dubov against Karjakin and see what Karjakin played. He went knight e4, and Dubov blitzed out the move bishop d5. At a low depth, the computer evaluates the move bishop d5 as the third best move. However, only when it starts to reach a much higher depth it understands Daniil Dubov's idea. Knight takes c3, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, bishop g5 attacking black's queen and developing a piece, knight e7 blocking the attack on the queen, castles, h6, bishop h4. And here at a low depth the computer recommends the move g5 and claims that white has to go bishop g3. However, I'm certain that Daniil Dubov had another idea in mind, namely knight takes g5, a phenomenal piece sacrifice. Now, pawn takes g5, bishop takes g5, and black's king is really not safe in the center, and if it ever castles to the king's side, well, it's really lacking pawn shelter as the g7 and h7 pawns are gone. In addition, the pin by the g5 bishop on the e7 knight is a very unpleasant one. So slightly stronger would be to play knight takes d5, knight f3, and then knight e7. Here, white plays bishop f6, attacking the rook on h8, and after the rook moves, black no longer has the option to queenside castle. Now rook e1, a very strong prophylactical move, in addition with getting the rook into the game. The idea is simple, that after d6 or d5, white is able to take on d6, and then later take on e7 with the rook, because the rook on e1 is also putting pressure on the e7 knight. And after a5, attempting to trade off the a and b pawn, which would open up the rook on a8, white has a really cool resource. Watch this, guys. Queen c2, pawn takes b4, queen h7, infiltrating the black position with the queen. And it turns out that after b3, hoping that white is going to take on b3, when black will be able to trade off some material and ease off white's initiative, white has a very cool resource, namely e6, opening up the e5 square for the knight. Now after d takes e, rook e d1, attacking the queen on d8, only way to defend it is bishop d7, and now comes knight e5. This is an attack on a checkmate, queen takes f7 is the threat, so rook f8 is a necessity to defend against it. Rook takes d7. Now if the queen moves, white is able to take on e7. Hence, queen takes d7, knight takes d7, and this is a very messy position, where black has a couple of pieces for the queen and a couple of pawns, but the evaluation of the position remains rather unclear. This is a sample line of what can happen after g5. So it is understandable that Karjakin didn't want to enter his opponent's preparation at the board. Hence, he castled in this position. Rook e1, we see this is a reoccurring idea, a prophylactic one, bringing the rook into the game and ensuring that black is unable to go d6, with the idea of bishop g4, getting the bishop on c8 out, because the knight on e7 is going to be hanging in these variations. It's also worth noticing that the bishop on b6 prevents the convenient development of the c8 bishop by going b6 and fianchettoing it, after having moved the rook, for instance. So the bishop on c8 is incredibly difficult to develop. Now, Karjakin tried the move queen e8. The idea is that the bishop on h4 no longer pins the knight to the queen, and knight takes d5, queen takes d5 is going to win black the bishop pair, in addition to removing the powerful bishop on d5. Hence, white's initiative will be diminished, and black will get the advantage of the two bishops. Another possible move was a5, intending to trade off the a and b pawn, after which black's rook on a8 would be doing very well on a semi-open file. However, white simply goes b5, not allowing this trade to happen. Queen a8, bishop b3, ensuring that knight takes d5 isn't played. a5, and now I encourage you to take a couple of seconds and think about what gorgeous move Daniil Dubov played in this position. Alright, he played bishop f6, placing his bishop dangerously close to the black king. The idea is that after pawn takes f6, suddenly, black's knight is pinned to the queen by the rook on e1. White will be able to regain the piece, in addition with black's king being incredibly weak, having lost the g-pawn as a shelter. Now in the game, Sergei Karjakin made his first inaccuracy. He goes e4, a4. The idea is that after bishop takes a4, the bishop on a4 will be distracted from the a2 g8 diagonal. From where it is eyeing the black king, in addition to pinning the f-pawn, which we will soon see plays a significant importance in the game. However, the downside of a4 is that after Dubov's correct bishop c4, black no longer has the option of trading off the a-pawn for the b-pawn, as he had when the pawn was on a5, and it will be difficult to activate the a8 rook. Here, Dubov-Karjakin tried knight g6, and Danil Dubov went queen d3. We could see the power of the bishop on the a2 g8 diagonal already, as white is intending to go queen takes g6, and the capture on g6 back will be impossible, as black's king is pinned. Then queen takes g7 checkmate would also follow. Now, let's see first what happens after king h8. White has a very cute resource. Knight h4, knight takes h4, queen h3. Now it turns out that if the knight retreats to g6, white simply takes on h6, and it turns out that black cannot recapture, as the g7 pawn is pinned to the king on h8 by the f6 bishop, and after king g8, queen takes g7 is going to be checked. And after knight f5, when queen takes h6 is no longer possible, as the knight on f5 defends against this idea, queen takes f5, d5, supposedly a double attack, as the bishop on c8 is threatening the queen and the bishop on c4 is threatened. White simply plays queen f4, and it turns out that the bishop on c4 cannot be taken due to the identical queen takes h6, queen g7 idea. And in this position, white has a very big initiative on the king side. In the game, Dubov-Karjakin chose to play d5. Pawn takes d6, now the rook on e1 is threatening the queen, and bishop e6, stepping in the way of the rook on e1. Now, something I'd mention is that if the queen if queen c2 was played instead, d5, pawn takes d6, bishop e6. Here white could try to play bishop takes c3 as well, because bishop takes c4 would not be attacking the queen and would simply give away the queen. However, having played queen d3, d5, pawn takes d6, bishop e6, bishop takes c3 is not as good anymore, because after bishop takes c4, the white queen on d3 is under attack, so queen takes c4 is a necessity, and here black has been able to liquidate white's powerful c4 bishop on the powerful a2 g8 diagonal, and white's initiative is not as strong as it previously was. But the question is, did Dubov really miss this, or does he have something genius in mind? I'll give you a few seconds, or however much time you need, to find the absolutely brilliant move played by Danil Dubov in this position. A little hint for those who are left in the dark is that Danil Dubov is often referred to as the modern-day Mikhail Tal. Alright, Danil Dubov took on g6 with the queen. Now we see that queen takes g7 checkmate is coming, so black is obligated to recapture the queen, and now comes rook takes e6. With a very powerful battery, with the c4 bishop and the bishop on f6, will also come into handy, as we'll see a few moves later. A potential discovered check by the rook can easily be fatal in this position, so Karjakin chose to defend his king with queen f7. And now Danil Dubov played the strong bishop takes c3, a very unmaterialistic approach, but perhaps the correct approach in this position, simply keeping up the tension with the monster bishops on c4 and c3. I'd like to mention that attempting rook e4, winning back black's queen, is in fact nearly losing, as after pawn takes f6, bishop takes f6, rook takes f7, it turns out that black is up a pawn, and nearly all pieces have been traded. Hence, white's initiative has faded away, so black is just left in a much better endgame. Hence, bishop takes c3. Now, bishop takes f2 is an interesting idea in this position. King takes f2, king h8, and here's the idea. After rook e4, queen f5 attacking the rook, rook e7 threatening bishop takes g7, followed by a retreat with the bishop along the a1 h8 diagonal. allows queen c2, followed by queen takes c3, with a near decisive advantage for black. This idea by white of going rook e4 and then rook e7 was played in the game, by the way, which is why I am mentioning this. However, after a move like rook a1, bringing in the final piece into the game, white's initiative is gigantic. The two monster bishops on c4 and c3 are dangerously pointing towards black's king, and this idea of rook e4, rook e7 is going to occur very shortly. And the free pieces are completely dominating the queen in this position. However, it's very unhuman-like to give away the piece with bishop takes f2, so Karjakin played king h8. And now after rook e4, queen f5, rook e7, as previously mentioned, the nasty threat of bishop takes g7, followed by moving away the bishop, is a threat that forces black to go rook g8 to simply defend the pawn on g7. Now white regains a little bit of material by taking on g8, rook takes g8, and then taking on c7. Now black goes for a double attack with queen c2, threatening the bishop as well as the f2 pawn, but after bishop e5, bishop takes f2, king h1, let us take a brief moment to evaluate this position. Both sides have 5 pawns. However, we can easily spot that the pawn on c7, which is defended very conveniently by the rook on e7 in conjunction with the e5 bishop, is a very strong passed pawn, which is 1 square away from the promotion square. In addition, we could look at the passive rook on g8, which is doomed to defend the g7 pawn, as after it moves, rook takes g7, followed by a discovered check by the rook, is going to be lethal for black. So black has a very passive rook on g8, and the pawn on c7 is very strong. So despite black having a little bit more material, a queen for a rook and a knight, white is winning. Bishop b6, h3, giving the king a flight square that it could potentially go to. King h7, rook a1, bringing the final piece into the game. a3, pushing the pawn. I'm going through these moves rather quickly, as white is nearly winning in this position. King h2, g5. Now, white really only needs to put more pressure on the g7 pawn, attack it once more, and it's going to collapse, and black's position is going to collapse. So knight d4, queen c4, knight f5. The plan is complete, and the pawn on g7 comes under fire by 3 pieces and is only defended by 2 pieces. Queen takes b4, rook c1. Now we see the power of the c7 pawn. It is 1 square away from the promotion square, and now c8 is a nasty idea by white, after which rook takes c8 would give away the rook for black. Now king g6, rook takes g7, king takes f5, rook takes g8, bishop takes c7, or else the pawn promotes, bishop takes c7, rook takes c7, hangs the bishop on e5, so this is not a good idea by white. Queen b2, rook c5 check, king e4, rook d8, and now white is going to go rook e5 next, followed by rook f8 checkmate, or followed by a discover check by the e5 rook. Hence, black will have to give up the queen after rook e5. White will be up an entire rook, so Karjakin chose to throw in the towel. If you've made it this far in the video, consider to subscribe. It really helps this channel out, and I'll be uploading more analysis on a weekly basis. Take care, everyone.